From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The presidential race always gets top billing every 4 years, but don't forget the contests for Congress. Control of both the House and the Senate are up for grabs next week, and control of each will have a large say in what either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump can achieve if they are elected. Welcome to Potomac Watch, the podcast of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. I'm Paul Gigot, the editor of those pages. I'm joined today by Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson, my editorial page colleagues who've been following the races across the country. And let's get into the Senate, which is critical for either president. Democrats now control 51 seats after what was really a debacle in 2022 for the Republicans when they nominated some less than ideal candidates and Democrats picked up a seat. This year, Republicans have done a much better job under their campaign committee chairman, Steve Daines of Montana, nominating better candidates. They're already all but certain to gain West Virginia with Governor Jim Justice, which would give them 50 seats if they hold their three vulnerable seats in Texas, Florida, and Nebraska. We'll get to those three seats a little bit later, but let's start with the Republican pickup opportunities. Those are in Montana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania for sure. Perhaps less so, but still possible in Nevada and probably unlikely at this point in Arizona. But that's a lot of pickup possibilities. Montana is the likeliest gain, Kim, with businessman Tim Sheehy, the Republican, taking on third-term incumbent Jon Tester. You've talked to Sheehy on your podcast. Where do you think this race is?
Yeah, I think you're very close to looking at a Senator Tim Sheehy. Right now, the Real Clear Politics average has him up 6.5 points. There have been polls out, though, that have higher numbers than that, up 8 points. And I think that this is a reflection of a couple of things. One, it's that Montana has changed some. It's actually become more red over the years. And it's funny, he made this point on the podcast, and it's good to remember that while Americans think of Montana as a red state out west, it was for a long time more of a purple state. A lot of registered Democrats there. That has shifted in particular over the last decade. And Jon Tester has shifted as well, which is what has hurt him. He won his seat 3 terms ago by running as an average dirt farmer, very much in tune with Montana values and principles, and got away with it for a long time. But his voting record has become very progressive, especially this past 6 years. And Sheehy has really hammered him on that. And he's spending a fortune, Tester is, and Democrats are, to retain him that seat. But he is just not connecting with the voters anymore.
It's interesting. Maybe his luck has run out. He has always managed to have a pretty good cycle to run in. That is where there wasn't a Republican president running at the top of the ticket. And this time he does. So Donald Trump is certainly going to help Sheehy in that race. Now, Kyle, the next pickup possibility is probably number 2 on most Republican lists is Ohio. Also because it's a state that has been trending towards the Republicans in the last decade or so. Bernie Moreno, a auto dealership owner, running against Sherrod Brown, a multi-term incumbent who pitches himself as a Democratic populist. It has been reported that he has told fellow Democrats that if Trump wins the state by fewer than 8 points, then he can win. If it's 8 or more, he's likely to lose.
I'm skeptical. That seems like a pretty high number of ticket splitters for Sherrod Brown to count on. I mean, I think he's been a pretty canny political operator. He knows the state well. He knows how to win the state. The problem for him, I think, is just that the state has been trending so far Republican. And the Real Clear Politics average has Trump up not by 8, but by 7 points. 7 points is a really hard deficit to make up if that's the kind of voters that are turning out.
Sherrod Brown has such a name recognition in the state. I know that there haven't been many ticket splitters, and the only Senate candidate who won in a state against the top of the ticket recently has been Susan Collins of Maine, the Republican. You don't think Sherrod Brown can do that?
I think he can get some ticket splitters, maybe a point, 2, 3, but 7. If Trump wins by 7, that is just a real tide to be pushing against. Also, one of the factors that's hard to calculate here is how many new voters, people who have not been regular voters, Trump is bringing out to the polls. Journal had an op-ed last week, interesting, from a couple of pollsters saying that they did surveys and 78% of undecided Senate voters would choose Mr. Trump if they're going to the polls and hadn't before. And so that suggests that a lot of these people who are Trump voters have not decided on the Senate races, but when they start to tune in, they will be voting for those Republican candidates down the ballot as well.
All right. So Ohio very much in the balance. Of course, Republicans pick up Montana. That's 51. Moreno would get you to 52. And then you have the 3 Great Lakes states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And Eric Hovden, Wisconsin versus incumbent Tammy Baldwin. Mike Rogers, former member of Congress versus current member of Congress, I think Elisa Slotkin. She's giving up her seat to run for the Senate. And then Dave McCormick, a businessman, served in the military with an Iraq tour against incumbent Bob Casey. Let's focus on Pennsylvania first and listen to Bob Casey's ad where he, of all things, associates himself with Donald J. Trump.
Casey's leading the effort to stop corporate greedflation and price gouging. Casey bucked Biden to protect fracking, and he sided with Trump to end NAFTA and put tariffs on China to stop them from cheating. So in this House, we agree. It's Bob Casey who's doing right by Pennsylvania.
I'm Bob Casey, and I definitely approve this message.
And I definitely think that wins the Chutzpah Award, Kim, for this election cycle for that ad campaign.
I'm with the fascists.
Yeah, I'm with the fascists. Hitler's on my side. It's quite something. But he clearly looks at the polling. I mean, that race is closed. It's now within a point or two, it looks like. I mean, I would have thought this would be a very hard race for McCormick to win, Kim, because Casey is one of those incumbents who has, other than name recognition, because his father was a popular governor, he has almost never taken a vote that anybody really knows about in the Senate.
Has ever paid attention to.
Yeah, exactly. He's accomplished almost nothing. He has no record to speak of. But that's hard to run against an incumbent who hasn't made people angry, right?
Exactly. No, you just put your finger on one of the great secrets of Washington is that the ticket to staying there forever is to do nothing, to offend no one, and to get nothing accomplished. And Casey is a master of that. He really is just this kind of blah candidate, but not in a way that turns people off, just in a way that they kind of ignore it. And then they go and they pull the lever again and again for him. And I think what's happening, though, in Pennsylvania, and it's very similar to what we were talking about in Montana and in Ohio, is that people are taking a little bit closer look at his record. And he has voted, obviously, with the progressive left many, many times, almost lockstep over, in particular, the past 6 years. And Dave McCormick is just a very good candidate. And again, all credit to Steve Daines for the crop of candidates he got this time around. But McCormick, he's articulate. And he is hitting hard on those issues that are at the top of voters' minds: inflation, interest rates, immigration. Another thing that's been popping up in a lot of these races, kind of I don't know if I'd call it a sleeper issue, but it's more that it's begun getting more attention, is housing prices. I guess that is connected to interest rates. But you're hearing a lot of Republicans talk more about what the Harris-Biden agenda has meant for younger people and middle-class people's inability to be able to purchase the American dream, a house. And the Democrats just don't have a lot of answers on this, because what can they do, right? That's the other problem, Paul, is they've got a guy in the White House whose last 4 years are clearly responsible for a lot of this mess. They've got a candidate at the top of the ticket who was alongside him and is refusing to distance herself at all, really, from any of his policies. And so what do? You run an ad pointing to the one time you ever did anything that put you on the same side as Donald Trump.
All right. Let's listen to Nikki Haley, the former South Carolina governor who ran against Donald Trump for president, campaigning for Dave McCormick recently in Pennsylvania.
I'm going to ask all of you to take the emotion out of this election. We need to take the emotion out of this election and really think about the policy and what it means for our kids and the next generation. When I tell you this can't be emotional, we have to do more than just elect Dave McCormick. We have to elect Donald Trump. Because if Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania, Dave McCormick wins Pennsylvania.
Kyle, that clip is very interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that Dave McCormick views Haley as an asset, and Donald Trump hasn't invited Nikki Haley to campaign with him. Now, Haley, she did 20% or so, 17 or 18% of the vote, of the primary vote, even though she had dropped out by the time of the race, by the time the Pennsylvania primary had taken place in the spring. So what this says is that McCormick is trying to get some of those Haley voters, some of those people who might have doubts about Donald Trump, to say, you got to elect Dave McCormick. And that's particularly important in the suburban counties around Philadelphia, Bucks, Montgomery, Chester, Delaware, and around Pittsburgh, Allegheny County. This is very interesting. And also interesting that Haley suggested let's elect Donald Trump, because McCormick for a while was trailing Donald Trump in some of the polling.
That's exactly right. And the history here is this is exactly how the last Republican senator won his seat. That was the much missed Pat Toomey in his 2016 re-election. He lagged Trump in Western Pennsylvania by 4 points, and he outperformed Trump by nearly 6 points in those Philadelphia suburbs. The challenge for McCormick is, I think, that kind of a 7-10 split, to use a bowling term, has gotten more challenging as these suburbs and suburban women, independent voters, have moved away from the Republican Party in the era of Donald Trump, because he probably has less room to outpoll Trump in those suburbs than Toomey did back in 2016. He's clearly making an effort at it by bringing Haley to the state, Allegheny County, that's where Pittsburgh is, and trying to bring that message to them. And the other factor to keep in mind here, too, is just that Trump may do better than the polling suggests. If Trump wins Pennsylvania by 1 or 2, then McCormick doesn't necessarily need to do that kind of a complicated math problem if he is, running behind Trump in Western Pennsylvania more strongly than Toomey was able to do last time.
Well, that's going to be a crucial race. And McCormick would immediately become, I think, a national Republican figure if he wins. All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the races in the Great Lakes states that are competitive when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on Potomac Watch with Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. Let's look at Wisconsin and Michigan, the Hoofda versus Baldwin race and Rogers versus Slotkin. Baldwin's an incumbent Democrat, but Slotkin is not. This is an open seat. But those races are also very, very close, and they've all closed, like the Pennsylvania race, in the last 3 or 4 weeks as the election nears, and I think the challengers become better known.
Yeah, and Paul, they're very close. You want to know how close? What might actually surprise you, looking at the Real Clear Politics averages this morning, the Wisconsin race has closed so much that it is now closer for Republicans than even the Ohio race, where Sherrod Brown is running for re-election. Tammy Baldwin has a 0.8% advantage in the Real Clear Politics average over Eric Hoofda at the moment. Again, a very good candidate. And I think one of the reasons you're seeing these close later is that the support for these Republicans, a kind of built-in support, was there all along from an electorate that is unhappy with the current environment and with the current incumbency. It took a long time, though, for them to get their money up and their name out. And that's finally really come true for them in recent weeks, especially the super PAC affiliated with Senate leader Mitch McConnell. The Senate Leadership Fund has been dumping a lot of funds in there and evening up those races to a certain degree. The Michigan race, at least in terms of the average, still looks a little bit more of a reach. It's 2.5% advantage to Slotkin in the Real Clear Politics average, which is closer to what you're seeing in Pennsylvania as well, too. But my view is that all of these races, in particular, these maybe not so much the Sheehy and Ohio races, but these Great Lakes races you're mentioning, I think an enormous amount of this in the end is just going to come down to the relative strength in the end of either Trump or Harris in those states. How much of their base gets out, and then how much, because it's a presidential, they vote a straight ticket.
Okay, let's talk about the three vulnerable seats, the ones that look competitive. How vulnerable isn't clear, but one is the surprise, I guess, is Nebraska, a right-leaning state that'll go comfortably for Trump. But Deb Fischer, the Republican incumbent, getting a challenge from an independent, Dan Osborne, who has said he will not caucus with the Democrats. So you can tell what that state majority is like, but he's hoping to slip in there and defeat Fischer, which could stymie the Republican majority. And then you have Colin Allred, a member of Congress, running against Ted Cruz in Texas. That race is quite close. Cruz won by, I think, 3 points in his last race. So Chuck Schumer is literally throwing in hundreds of billions of dollars. I don't know if he got over 100 yet, but probably will by the end of it, against Cruz. That would be a bellwether race, and that could stymie the majority too. And then you have Debbie McChrystal-Powell running against Rick Scott, the incumbent in Florida, though Scott seems comfortably ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, I'm skeptical that there are going to be Democratic wins in any of those three states simply because of the fundamentals of the state voter turnout and the popularity of Trump in those states. For what it's worth, the Cook Political Report ranks all of them as either leaning Republican or likely Republican still, Florida being the one that is likely. I mean, I do think there's warnings here for Republican incumbents that you can't be complacent about the care and feeding of constituents, and you have to be mindful of changes in the electorate and the demographics of those states. Texas has been the Democratic white whale for years now. Remember all the hype for Beto O'Rourke, who was going to beat Ted Cruz last time, which didn't end up happening. On the other hand, the cities in Texas vote similar to the cities anywhere else. And as those cities grow in population, there is a risk at some point down the road of Texas flipping, which would make life very difficult for the Republican Party nationally. And so I think that is a signal to Republicans to be mindful of that and make sure they're calibrating their message with that in mind.
I know you talked to Ted Cruz on your podcast, Kim. His issue, I guess, the big challenge for him is he's got to make sure he gets enough women.
Yeah. And he was open about that. He said publicly that Donald Trump has turned off a lot of women. We obviously see that in the gender gap out there. Trump is winning men by a mile, but she's winning women by a mile. And so he said that one of the things he's been doing, we've been talking a lot in this podcast about suburban voters. He's been going around, stopping in a lot of those places, trying to remind Republicans about what he's done for the state in the Senate and his positions, and talk to them about the issues and try to get their minds a little bit off of Trump and his rhetoric and more back on the policy question.